Stellar Blade is an enigma of a video game. A PlayStation 5 exclusive that was developed by a relative newcomer to the console space in Korean studio ShiftUP, the game kind of surprised everyone. It surprised the players who were excited for the game, as they got a markedly different experience from the one they thought they were getting. It surprised Sony and ShiftUP too, as the game exceeded sales expectations and by all accounts is a smashing success. It even surprised those of us who follow the internet and gaming culture as a whole, as there was this whole mini culture war that erupted over the game's character designs and depictions of the game's female protagonist. And, if that weren't enough, there was a second controversy over alleged censorship and how some of the game's unlockable costumes were toned down prior to the release of the game. And yet, in spite of all of that, Stellar Blade succeeded. The game did exceedingly well, and there are now conversations happening out in the public about a potential sequel, and this being a big series for both Sony and ShiftUP. And that's all well and good. It's cool. I like Stellar Blade. But what's most interesting to me is why and how Stellar Blade succeeded, despite all the odds that had been stacked against the game prior to its release. What is it about the game that won over so many people? What exactly did it do right, and to such a degree that allowed it to basically combat all the negativity and potential missteps that were taken before the game's release? Well, that's what I've been puzzling over for the last few months. And after a lot of introspection, research, and just general musing over this confounding question, I think I have the answers. So, let's talk about how Stellar Blade succeeded. Now, a word of caution before we dive in. This video will contain heavy spoilers for Stellar Blade. So, if you haven't beaten the game, viewer discretion here is advised. To start off, and to truly understand the appeal and eventual success of Stellar Blade, a bit of a look at the history of video games is in order, I think. Let's take a trip down memory lane and go back to the early 2000s and the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 era is regarded by many as one of the best eras of video games. The reasons for this reverence are numerous, but perhaps the biggest reason was where video games as a medium and as an industry were at the time. This was the moment in the medium's history when 3D graphics evolved from being blocky, polygonal representations of things to believable and engaging visuals that added a ton of immersion and excitement to the game-playing experience. It wasn't just the graphics either, as games started to really hone in on the entertainment side of the medium: storytelling, production values, music, and the integration of all those ancillary elements into the overall game-playing experience transformed video games from just games that you won or beat to ultimately becoming interactive experiences that you engaged with. Video games were getting more detailed, expansive, and more immersive than ever. But an important aspect of the era was also the fact that making video games was still a somewhat easier and more accessible affair than what it is today. Game budgets were creeping into the multi-million mark at this point, say in the 5 to 10 million range. Expensive, sure, but compared to what is needed today, where games can cost more than blockbuster Hollywood movies, game budgets were certainly still manageable at the time. And of course, a big reason for those manageable budgets was the fact that games didn't take as long to make as they do today as well. Game development cycles were at around 2 to 3 years at this point. The lower budgets and shorter development time meant that games could really make a lot less money and still be profitable, lucrative affairs for all of those involved in making them. And it was in this kind of era that video game fans got to see the birth of many a fan favorite genre or game series. A lot of the gameplay styles, genres, and franchises that we are familiar with today all originate from that unique time when games were growing but were still small enough to take risks and be experimental. Now, looking at it from a purely player perspective though, for me, and I suspect a large chunk of nostalgic video game fans of that era, the real reason the PS2 era was so special for us was because of how fun games still used to be in those times. It was a time before the deeply narrative-based experiences of the PlayStation 3 era, or the long 60 to 100 hour open world games that became popular in that very generation. Even gimmicks like DLC and motion controls hadn't been invented yet. So, the focus was squarely on making video games fun, enjoyable, and rewarding experiences and franchises that players would pick up, get attached to, and then likely become lifelong fans of and support. Today, in 2024, we're in a much different landscape, I'd say. Games are huge, expensive, expansive affairs that can take months of dedication and investment to even properly play and finish. There's DLC to buy, and an ever-growing effort from game developers to really lock in players to their specific game for as long as possible. And, sadly, with that engagement-based focus, the drive to have players actually see everything in a game, to complete it and experience it all, is almost entirely absent from a lot of modern video games. Okay, so, what does all of this have to do with Stellar Blade and its success, you ask? Well, quite a bit actually. I'm not entirely sure if it was fully intentional, but Stellar Blade as a video game and a complete package really embodies all of the best qualities of the PlayStation 2 era of gaming. Is it because this is Developer ShiftUP's first console game, and as a new developer they're just kind of working their way up from the past in terms of game design? Or are the developers people like me, who grew up playing games in the PlayStation 2 era and that influenced the design and the development of their game? It's honestly hard to tell. Whatever the case, Stellar Blade was a surprising game to play and absorb when it came out in April of this year. And a lot of that surprise, I think, had to do with the game's pre-release marketing and just the general buzz surrounding the game at the time. I mentioned the culture war and controversy surrounding the game's costumes, and while that's certainly something to get into, there is a much bigger elephant in the room. That elephant was the mammoth of a beloved game known as Nier Automata. In an interview by IGN Japan, just 10 days before the release of the game, famed developer Yoko Taro gave Stellar Blade a glowing recommendation, calling the game much better than his own Nier Automata. Now, for those of us who are familiar with Yoko Taro and his personality, this doesn't seem that odd. Yoko Taro is known as a bit of a humble visionary in the video game directing space, and will often be self-deprecating in a lot of what he puts out about himself and his work. Yet, by Sony and ShiftUP doing this interview and getting that glowing recommendation, expectations for Stellar Blade definitely went in a particular direction. Expectations can really shape an experience, and I suspect that a good chunk of the people who came into Stellar Blade were expecting an action RPG with a deep, tragic post-apocalyptic world, a thought-provoking story, and fun Devil May Cry style action combat. That is, a game like Nier Automata. And yet, the final experience of Stellar Blade can't be further from that description as a video game. Stellar Blade is not some introspective experience that uses the video game medium to make you feel something that you've never felt before. Rather, both to my surprise and delight, Stellar Blade is a game that's just a fun roller coaster ride. Its focus is squarely on entertaining its player, providing a wealth of different experiences and fun gameplay moments, and it's less focused on telling some kind of deep and meaningful interactive story. And it's because of what Stellar Blade is, and what it is not, that the comparisons to the Nier series and Yoko Taro's work feel like a bit of a disservice to the excellent game that Stellar Blade actually is. Stellar Blade borrows the vibe, feel, and even general post-apocalyptic sci-fi world building from Nier Automata, for sure, but that really is about where the similarities start and where they end. In a lot of ways, Nier Automata is a unique and exemplary video game, in that it uses the medium of video games to tell a very unique kind of story. It explores themes in a way that only the particular interactive medium of video games can. The gameplay, while fun and engaging being that it was crafted by action game veterans Platinum Games, is just another tool or device to further the narrative and the themes of what Yoko Taro is trying to get at with the game. What is life? What does it mean to be human? How do we come together as a species? Those are some of the key ideas being focused on in Nier Automata. The world, the gameplay mechanics, the graphics, the art direction, everything is singularly focused on making the player experience and feel something truly special and unique. Stellar Blade, on the other hand, is almost the complete opposite side of the coin in terms of a video game. Stellar Blade is a game that is interested in providing exhilaration and thrills. It's meant to be a roller coaster ride, with twists and turns that keep you engaged and entertained as you play it. Beyond that, however, it isn't trying to be much else. To that end, the story, characters, graphics, art direction, and world building all serve as a sort of backdrop or mood setter for the kind of experience that Stellar Blade wants to go for. And that experience? It's that of an action game that's got really fun combat, extremely impressive boss battles, and some jaw-dropping set-piece moments. All of that is punctuated and accentuated by a supporting set of open-world gameplay segments, simple side quests, some light platforming, and even some survival horror-style shooting segments to keep things fresh. And of course, there's the unlockable suits and collectibles, which really kind of round out the whole experience. The gameplay loop for Stellar Blade is actually surprisingly simple. There's an alternation between linear, action game levels and open world segments, with each culminating in its own sort of boss fight and story twist that moves everything forward. And in between those levels, whichever type you're going through, are a ton of collectibles and secrets to find. Health upgrades, power upgrades, side missions, readable flavor text entries, and even some really out there collectibles like soda cans that the game litters throughout its 35-ish hour runtime. What's really cool and different is that all the collectibles and side missions dole out some kind of meaningful reward. And most of the time, it's a cool new suit or a costume for the game's protagonist Eve to wear and show off while you're continuing to play the game. Again, this is something that is sorely missed these days, and it's something that was common in the PlayStation 2 era. A big part of the fun of playing a game was unlocking various cosmetics and costumes, and then using them to change up the look and feel of the game you were playing. These days, cosmetics are used as a way to get extra money in the form of DLC for games, but there's just something magical about having well-designed, interesting costumes that you can equip, find, and use as part of the core game experience. It's something that I really used to enjoy engaging with. Unlocking alternate costumes and looks was really one of the main rewards for finding collectibles or beating a game with various achievements or objectives. It made replaying games a lot more fun too, and gave some extra value to an experience that had already kind of locked you in at that point. Alternate endings and costumes included in the core experience of the game were something that we've lost from the majority of games today. And seeing Stellar Blade bring that back with today's visuals and graphics is a real joy to behold. And speaking of joy and beholding, one other thing that's equally interesting and perhaps a bit controversial about Stellar Blade is in how Developer ShiftUP has handled the game's character designs. Most prominently, the design of the game's protagonist, Eve. Eve is based off a combination of 3D scans of Korean model Shin Jae-un and Developer ShiftUp's talent of 3D artists. And the result? Well, it's a character that's definitely made to be attractive and focuses on the very feminine kind of beauty viewed through a kind of cultural lens of South Korea. Video games in the West have, in some ways, grown up, and in other ways, become a bit weird in how they present and represent characters today. Going back to the PlayStation 2 era, every character in a game was generally good looking or at least aiming to be attractive. That in itself undoubtedly got pretty samey after a while, and so the Western video game industry and its artists have definitely tried to course correct and bring more variety to the kinds of characters and people that you get to see in video games. A noble goal. Unfortunately, of course, these days it's arguable that the balance has shifted too far in the other direction. Most Western developed game characters in general are designed to either look normal or be flawed or different in some kind of way. The era of attractive female characters in particular seems like a thing of the past, and it's worth at least noting that, because the majority of the game industry has now left a void for seeing attractive and good-looking video game characters alongside the plain, average, and sometimes the grotesque. Stellar Blade almost revels in the sort of old-style Hollywood presentation, where the main characters of the game are attractive and supermodel-like. And while this would have been a side note and a pretty common thing in video games 10 years ago, it's a surprisingly real breath of fresh air and a break from the norm today. What's old is new again, and in many ways, Stellar Blade mixes the old with some new. We talked about the character designs, but another place where this is more evident is in the game's combat, which is a unique and surprising mix of Devil May Cry style character action games and the more deliberate, slow-paced, and weighty Soulsborne genre that From Software has pioneered. There's elements from everything here, from Sekiro's parries, to the Dark Souls movement and lock-on, to the perfect dodges and slowdowns, and of course, attack combos from Devil May Cry. And it all works surprisingly well together. The combat is easily the best part of Stellar Blade, and it's the thing that will ultimately have you playing the game for its entire runtime. And really, there's three particular aspects that make Stellar Blade's combat so good. Those three things are freedom, depth, and variety. For one thing, Stellar Blade isn't interested in pushing you down a particular playstyle in the way that, say, a From Software game like Sekiro does. Parrying is a viable tool at your disposal, but so is being focused on dodging and perfect dodges. Both styles reward you with power-ups and abilities to use, and you really can customize and upgrade Eve to really focus on playing the game in the way that you want to play. The freedom, as it were, is something that's lacking in even some of the best action games and action RPGs these days, with recent games like Lies of P, for example, really pushing you towards parrying, for instance. Of course, freedom is well and good, but there's also a layer of depth that makes games like Stellar Blade such a joy to play. Yeah, you have a parry mechanic, and yes, you have perfect dodges, but those things are really only the beginning of the game's combat system. As you make your way through the game and unlock things and abilities, you get a series of abilities and attacks that actually mesh into the dodge or parry system as a sort of starting point. Landed that perfect dodge? Well, you can immediately follow it up with an attack that has Eve dash into her enemy, unleashing serious damage with a slash and closing the gap between them. But wait, you can then follow that up with a finishing move combo that does even more massive damage. Every aspect of the game's combat system is like this, where there's at least 2 layers of depth to almost every mechanic. And that makes for such an interesting and diverse set of tools and techniques at the player's disposal that the combat remains fresh and interesting throughout the whole game's runtime. By the end of the game, you'll find yourself seamlessly switching from one of your normal combo attacks to perfect dodging, to parrying, to unleashing your burst moves, to then using a different set of beta energy moves, and then even unleashing context-sensitive moves like blink and repulse. And of course, halfway through the game, you also unlock a special ability mode that is basically the devil trigger from Devil May Cry, complete with its own set of upgrades, skill tree, and combos and follow-up attacks to learn. Now, all of these tools are great, but a toolset is only really as solid of a toolset if you get to use it in interesting and varied ways. That's where the third element comes in: variety. Again, this is something that's been sorely missed from the PlayStation 2 era, where games were not as long as they are today, and could afford to keep introducing new enemies, challenges, and gameplay mechanics throughout their entire runtime. Stellar Blade, despite being a slightly longer game at 35-ish hours for a first playthrough, features a staggering amount of variety in not only the things you fight, but the things you do. In each of the game's various levels and locations, you'll continue to encounter new enemies and monsters to fight. It's not like there's entirely no recycling, as the game will smartly reuse bosses from earlier parts of the game, but either supercharge them or put you in a space or context that makes the entire battle shift in some kind of unique way. It's not just the bosses either, however, as each of the game's various maps and locations will have a mix of good old standard fodder and some new enemy types that can be fun and relatively easy to kill. Each will have their own set of attacks, parry timings, dodge windows, and of course, weak points that can be learned and discovered. That kind of enemy variety is key to keeping an action game from feeling repetitive or boring. And as I talk about all of this, my mind really wanders back to last year's big action RPG, Final Fantasy XVI, incidentally the first game that was ever covered on this channel. That game really tried to stretch out the 12-hour action game experience to a 60-ish RPG level runtime. If you go look at that video, I broke down how the game was less than successful at that expansive runtime. The major problem there, ultimately, was a severe lack of not only enemy variety, but interesting and unique things to do. In contrast, Stellar Blade easily sidesteps this issue by giving you tons of side content to busy yourself with if you so desire. There are, of course, side quests in the game, which are pretty simple and generic for the most part, but thankfully go beyond just being simple fetch quests or monster hunts like in Final Fantasy XVI. Some will reveal additional story context, or have you try to uncover some kind of mystery, or solve a unique puzzle or problem. So there's at least some variety in even the most basic of side quests in the game. There's even some multi-part side quests in the game, which form a sort of series based on a particular NPC or side character, and ultimately reveal something rather interesting about the world that Stellar Blade takes place in, or the characters involved. Now look, the quests aren't as deep or as interesting as anything you could find in, say, the Nier series, but they're definitely not as repetitive or bland as the one found in Final Fantasy XVI either. And that middle ground kind of works here, as the quests don't overstay their welcome and serve to be nothing more than the distractions and sources of upgrades for your character in terms of cosmetics or the game's in-game economy. There are some light platforming and survival horror sections as well, and those really break up the experience and use a game design technique that isn't quite used as much today as I would like to see. There's this whole idea of the change of pace, and it's something that a really old and solid episode of the video game design channel, Extra Credits, covered many years ago. The idea is a simple one, in that a video game uses different gameplay styles to really shift and change up both the pacing and the flow of a video game's experience. In that vein, you'll find Stellar Blade uses this particular idea to great effect. You have open world exploration segments where you can go over a huge wide map and tackle objectives at your discretion. Then you've got linear missions that feel more on rails and are kind of a direct, straight through line through a particular level. And in those various levels, you've got platforming that borrows from everything from Prince of Persia's wall running to Tomb Raider style jumps and shimmying on platforms to tunnel-based slide sections that remind me of the dive segments from an old Spider-Man game or two. There's even some nice survival horror style dark corridor shooting segments that really vary the pace and slow things down for the game letting you really take in the atmosphere of these sci-fi small places that you end up visiting. And if all of that weren't enough, there are even fun little diversions like a fishing minigame or collecting the earlier mentioned soda cans that all play into the overall experience of getting and unlocking things for Eve, whether it be experience or a cool costume or two. An interesting thing to note though is that collecting all the optional diary entries and flavor text entries in the game actually contributes to a meter that can determine what kind of ending you get at the end of the game. And it's that kind of consequence to the game's side activities that really ties the experience together and makes everything you do in the game feel both meaningful and rewarding, even when you're dealing with the game's more tedious or less impressive bits. And rewarding really is the key word to describe Stellar Blade for me. Every aspect of the experience feels like it's there to make the one who's playing it feel rewarded. The game isn't super hard like a Souls game, and it gives you enough items, healing, powers, and abilities to make going through it fun and rewarding, no matter how much time you end up investing and how much you end up engaging with the game's systems. Looking at a game like Lies of P, for instance, which I'd argue is actually a much deeper and perhaps, some would argue, better game, I'd say Stellar Blade actually has the edge in terms of mass appeal and accessibility. Because, unlike Lies of P, Stellar Blade has something for you even if you don't want to really give it the time and investment necessary to get every aspect of its systems down. There are multiple difficulty levels here. Enemies don't hit you as hard, and you're given the leeway to make some mistakes and rely on a few crutches here and there to get through the game. And, should you decide to really dive into Stellar Blade's mechanics and systems, well, then you're truly rewarded with even more powerful moves, cool animations, and a much more engaging and exciting combat experience. Even things like the game's platforming segments, while a bit janky and off, can give a real sense of reward and fulfillment when you get through them, in the same way that many old PlayStation 2 games did. Once again, I'm not sure if this is intentional or a happy accident, but at the end of the day, it works to really hone in on that sense of nostalgia that PlayStation 2 fans, like myself, are hungering for. Looking at it as a whole, is every aspect of Stellar Blade perfect? No, not at all. Stellar Blade is Developer ShiftUP's freshman effort at making a console action game, and in that, they do quite a few things exceedingly well, and stumble on some others. The story is pretty predictable and shallow. The platforming can feel less refined and a bit janky, and the puzzle segments can certainly feel a bit out of place and even slow down the pacing a bit unintentionally. But, as a whole, even with those warts, I think the game ends up feeling like it has nostalgic callbacks to that less refined PlayStation 2 era of gaming, even if perhaps not everything is meant to be an ode to the degree that it feels like. In the end, for me, Stellar Blade feels like a modern incarnation of a game that would sit comfortably in the old PlayStation 2 era that I love. It does some things really well, and manages to use its less than strong aspects in at least interesting and unique ways. In an age where we get a lot of cookie cutter, safe, and decent experiences, something that really hits it out of the park with one aspect, in this case the combat, and focuses on being interesting with everything else, well, I'll take that any day of the week. And really, that, I think, is the key secret ingredient to the game's success. The game provides something that's both fresh and unique in some ways, while also being something that brings back aspects of video games that are sorely being missed today from the past. To that end, I'm thankful that it seems like Stellar Blade and ShiftUP are here to stay. The game this year has already exceeded expectations in terms of sales. It was the top-selling game in the US in April, and it topped the physical charts at the end of April for the UK, and it's been selling out in Japan as well. Even the South Korean government is taking notice, and has pledged to invest in the console gaming space following the release of Stellar Blade. So it's easy to see that there's a pretty decent market among PlayStation gamers for this kind of game. With that success, and the game's 3 endings, which really hint at an unresolved story, well, I'm happy and hopeful to see the series continue, and to see how ShiftUP further refines this winning formula and recipe that they built with this game. And as always, I'm really curious to hear what you thought of Stellar Blade. Did the game remind you of the PS2 era in the same way it did for me? Did it feel like it took a bit too much inspiration from Nier Automata at times? What did you think of the game's 3 endings? And is Korea really going to emerge as a new game industry juggernaut after both this game and Lies of P? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk about what is undoubtedly one of the year's best and most interesting video games.